The night had settled heavily over Scranton, Pennsylvania, the kind of night when the entire town seemed to be asleep. The houses on the valley floor glowed faintly with the warm hum of street lamps, while up on the hill the silence of the old cemetery reigned. A pale moon hung over the rows of headstones, its light so sharp it made the marble crosses gleam like polished bone. No cars passed on the nearby road. Not even the wind moved through the crooked trees. The world appeared frozen. But in the farthest corner, where the graves grew newer and the earth still bore the raw marks of recent burials, there was motion. 2 men worked there, their shadows jerking back and forth in the moonlight. Their shovels dug steadily into the soil, each scrape and thud unnervingly loud in the stillness. They did not speak much, except for the occasional grunt as they threw up another pile of dirt. The damp smell of earth hung heavy in the air. A passerby might have thought they were grave robbers, but no one passed this hill at night. Only the moon and a few restless crows bore witness. A few feet away, on a rusted metal bench, sat a woman. Her figure was wrapped in a dark coat, her hands clenched tightly together in her lap. Helen O'Connor watched the men work without flinching, her face pale but determined. She had not moved since they began, not when the first shovelful of dirt hit the ground, not when the hole deepened enough that the men's shadows seemed to vanish into it. She was as much a part of the scene as the gravestones themselves, immovable, unwilling to turn away. One of the men finally broke the silence. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve, his breath visible in the chill air. "Ma'am, are you sure about this? Maybe you don't want to go through with it. Disturbing a grave, it ain't right." Helen's eyes did not leave the mound of earth. Her voice was steady, though it seemed pulled from deep within her chest. "I'm sure. Keep digging. I paid you for this, and I need it done." The second man let out a nervous chuckle, shaking his head as he leaned on his shovel. "I still don't get it. We dig him up, then what? You're not planning to take him home, are you?" Helen turned her face toward him then, the moonlight catching her tired features. Her lips trembled, but her words came firm. "No, I only need to see him. Just once. Then you can cover it again." The men exchanged looks in the darkness. They had thought she might be drunk or insane, but the weight in her tone told them otherwise. She was stone-cold sober, grief carved into every line of her face. The taller man tried again. "Lady, he's been in the ground for weeks. Whatever you think you'll see, it won't be him the way you remember." Helen's hands tightened on her lap, her nails digging into her skin. "I'll still know it's my son. I'll recognize him, no matter what time has done." Her words silenced them. They turned back to their shovels, the metal biting into the soil with renewed rhythm. Helen sat rigid, and in her silence her mind wandered, unwanted, unstoppable, back to the life that had led her here. Michael, her boy, the only good thing she had left in this world. Her marriage had ended years ago. Her husband had walked away, leaving her with nothing but an empty house and whispers behind her back. Friends had drifted away, pity in their eyes. Family lived far, wrapped in their own lives. But Michael, her miracle child, had been her anchor. Every step of his life she had watched with pride, from his first breath to his first steps, from the school plays to the track meets where his legs flew faster than the others. She had poured everything into him, every hope, every sacrifice, every sleepless night at her desk balancing bills. And now the army told her he was gone, buried overseas. No body returned, no chance to say goodbye. Just paperwork, just official words delivered without his face. Helen's heart refused to believe. Something was wrong. She felt it in her bones, in the silence of her house, in the way her dreams seemed to call his name. And if the world thought she had gone mad, so be it. A mother had the right to see the truth with her own eyes. The clinking of shovels against something solid jerked her back into the present. The men's voices rose in low mutters as they hit the coffin lid. One of them spat into the dirt and laughed uneasily. "Well, here we are. God help us." Helen rose slowly from the bench, her knees stiff from the cold. She stepped closer to the edge of the grave, her eyes locked on the dark shape emerging from the earth. Her breath came shallow, but she showed no fear. Not of the night, not of the law, not of death itself. The men looked up at her, expecting hesitation, expecting her to turn away. But Helen stood tall, her face pale beneath the moonlight, her expression unwavering. "Open it," she said quietly. And with that, the night seemed to grow colder, the cemetery falling into a silence so deep it pressed against their ears. The only sound left was the ragged breathing of two men and the steady beat of a mother's heart, waiting for the truth that lay just beneath the lid of that coffin. Long before Helen O'Connor found herself standing over a half-dug grave, she had lived the kind of quiet, ordinary life that most small-town women in Pennsylvania knew all too well. She had married young in her early 20s to a man she thought she could build a family with. They had a modest house on the edge of Scranton, close to the paper mills and the coal-stained hills. For years, they tried to have children. Every doctor's appointment, every test, ended with the same disheartening words: "I'm sorry, Mrs. O'Connor, it's unlikely." The diagnosis became a weight pressing down on the marriage. At first, her husband offered comfort, saying they could adopt or simply live as a family of two. But the years wore on, and the whispered gossip from relatives and neighbors gnawed at him. He grew restless, resentful, and distant. Eventually, he walked out. Helen had seen it coming, but still, the final slam of the door left a hollow echo inside her chest. He went on to marry a younger woman who quickly gave him the children Helen never could. For a while, Helen thought her story had ended there. She buried herself in work, taking an office job in a local firm, balancing spreadsheets and filing endless papers. Her life shrank into routines: morning coffee, long bus rides, quiet evenings in front of the television. Friends disappeared. Family checked in less often. The house became a tomb of silence. And then, in one unexpected moment, everything changed. He was younger than her, barely out of college, sent to the office as a junior associate. His name was Sean, full of the eager energy that only youth carries. They worked late on a project together, and when the evening stretched on and no one else was left in the building, he asked if she wanted a ride home. She should have said no, but the loneliness was unbearable and his smile was kind. That ride turned into coffee at a diner, then laughter over pie, then a night that Helen would never forget. The next morning, shame had struck hard. He was in his mid-20s. She was nearly 40. The age difference was too much. She told him it couldn't happen again. Sean didn't argue. He drifted out of her life almost as quickly as he had entered it, leaving Helen convinced that what happened was nothing more than a brief lapse of judgment. But weeks later, when her body betrayed its secret, she realized it had been something else entirely. She was pregnant. At first, she refused to believe it. Doctors had told her for years it was impossible. She had lived her adult life under the shadow of infertility, and now here she was, nearly 40, staring at the trembling plus sign on a test strip. She went to the clinic, expecting them to tell her it was a mistake. Instead, the doctor frowned over the charts, then looked at her with weary caution. "At your age, Mrs. O'Connor, the risks are very high. I don't advise you to continue." Helen sat stiff in the chair, her hands shaking. She thought of the years she had begged God for a child, the countless nights she had cried into her pillow. And now, when life finally handed her this miracle, the doctor wanted her to turn it away? "No," she whispered, her voice trembling but firming with each word. "I'm keeping this baby. Whatever happens, this is mine." From that moment on, her life had new purpose. She endured the whispers of neighbors, the raised eyebrows at church, the pitying looks from coworkers. None of it mattered. Her child was coming, and she would protect him with everything she had. When Michael was born, screaming and pink and perfect, Helen wept so hard the nurse thought something was wrong. She held him to her chest, inhaling his warmth, and knew she was no longer alone. He was her son, her miracle. The past no longer mattered. The future was written in his tiny fingers curled around hers. Raising him alone was no easy task. Money was always tight. She clipped coupons, worked overtime, patched hand-me-down clothes until the fabric thinned beyond repair. Nights were long and quiet, the kind that threatened to drag her back into loneliness. But Michael's laughter was enough to keep her steady. Every scraped knee, every school play, every science fair ribbon, she stored each memory like treasure. Michael grew quickly, stronger with each passing year. He was bright, curious, and fiercely determined. Teachers praised his sharp mind. Coaches admired his speed on the track. He never complained about the lack of luxuries other kids had. Instead, he seemed to understand instinctively that his mother was giving him everything she could, and he repaid it with love. Helen watched him blossom with pride swelling in her chest. When he ran on the school field, legs pumping like pistons, she saw not just an athlete, but a young man destined for something greater. When he studied late at night, scribbling equations and reading thick textbooks, she believed he would make it to college and beyond. The world would finally give him what it had denied her. She had lost a husband, lost years to grief, but in Michael she gained a reason to live again. He was her anchor, her hope, her proof that miracles were possible. In his eyes, she saw the promise of a future she thought she'd never touch. And because of that, when the army came to tell her he was gone, it felt like not just her son had been buried, but her entire reason for existence. The summer after Michael O'Connor's high school graduation should have been filled with plans for college, with applications, acceptance letters, and hopeful talks about majors. Helen had been certain her son would follow that path. He had the grades, the athletic ability, and the determination to do well in any university. She had even begun saving modestly for tuition, clipping more coupons, setting aside extra hours at work, all to give him the start she never had. But one evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table of their small Scranton home, Michael cleared his throat and spoke words that shattered her assumptions. "Mom, I've decided. I'm going to enlist in the army." The fork slipped from Helen's hand, clattering against her plate. She stared at him, her chest tightening. "What do you mean, enlist?" "Michael, you just graduated. You can go straight to college. You don't need to do this." Michael's blue eyes were steady, unwavering in a way that reminded her painfully of her late father-in-law, a man known for his stubborn streak. "I've thought about it a lot," he said. "I don't want to start school knowing they could call me any time. I'd rather serve first, get it done, then go to college. Besides, after service, I'll have the GI Bill. It'll help pay for tuition." Helen shook her head, her heart racing. "Honey, you're only 19. You don't have to throw yourself into danger. You can study now, get your deferment, and figure it out later." But Michael leaned forward, his voice calm but resolute. "Mom, I want this. I want to serve my country. It's not just about school. It's about doing my part." Her protests faltered against the determination etched on his face. He was no longer the boy she had rocked to sleep or cheered for at track meets. He was a young man making his own decisions, and no amount of pleading could sway him. Helen saw that truth and felt a chill of helplessness. The day of his departure arrived faster than she could have imagined. The small train station in Scranton was crowded with families, friends, and neighbors, all gathered to send off their young recruits. Balloons bobbed in the summer air. Flags waved in children's hands. The hum of conversations was punctuated by laughter, tears, and the sharp whistles of station attendants. Michael stood tall in his new uniform, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder. To Helen, he looked impossibly grown-up and heartbreakingly young at the same time. Around him clustered his classmates, friends who had come to say goodbye, and a few of their parents offering handshakes and pats on the back. Rachel Stein was there too, clutching his arm tightly. She had been Michael's first real love, the the girl he had walked home from football games and studied with late into the night. Her eyes shimmered with tears. She tried to blink away. She smiled for him, but her fingers trembled where they gripped his sleeve. Helen stood beside them, her chest aching as she watched her son embrace his friends one by one. When it was finally time to board, Michael turned to his mother and wrapped her in his arms. She clung to him, inhaling the scent of his shampoo, memorizing the feel of his broad shoulders. Desperate to hold on to the boy, she was about to let go. "I'll be okay, Mom," he whispered. "I promise. It's just for a while. Then I'll come back, and we'll celebrate, and I'll start school." Helen's voice broke as she whispered back, "Please, Michael, be safe. Don't let anything happen to you." Rachel then stepped forward, throwing her arms around him. They clung to each other as though the world itself was splitting apart. "I'll wait for you," Rachel whispered fiercely, her tears soaking into his collar. "I don't care how long it takes." The train whistle blew, sharp and final. Michael pulled away, hoisted his bag higher, and gave them both one last smile. Brave, confident, trying to comfort them more than himself. Then he turned and boarded with the others. Helen and Rachel stood together on the platform, their hands finding each other, and watched until the train disappeared down the tracks. In the weeks that followed, letters and phone calls trickled in from basic training. The Army allowed occasional contact, and Michael used every chance to assure his mother he was fine. His voice over the phone was cheerful, sometimes even teasing. "Mom, don't worry so much. They're just drills. The food's terrible, but I'm surviving. And Rachel keeps sending me candy, so I'm the most popular guy in the barracks." Helen tried to laugh along, tried to let his optimism ease her worry. But when the calls ended and the line went silent, the fear crept back in. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made a mistake letting him go without more of a fight. Michael sounded brave, yes, but he was still her child. And though she told herself to trust him, to trust the system, a mother's heart is never fully at peace. Beneath every cheerful letter, every upbeat call, Helen felt the shadow of dread. Something inside her whispered that this choice, his choice, would carry them all into a darkness she had no power to stop. Autumn settled over Scranton, the trees burning with shades of amber and crimson. Helen O'Connor had taken to watching the news every evening, her mug of tea cooling in her hands as she half listened, waiting for the familiar voice of her son on the phone. Michael's calls had become the anchor of her weeks. Short bursts of laughter, assurances, stories about grueling drills, and jokes about Army food. She lived for those minutes, clinging to them long after the line went dead. Then, one Saturday morning, her phone rang. The name on the screen wasn't Michael's. It was Rachel Stein. "Helen!" Rachel's voice trembled, words rushing as if they might vanish if not spoken quickly. "Have you seen the news? Turn on the TV. Now." Helen's stomach dropped. She fumbled with the remote, her fingers stiff. The screen flickered to life, and the cheerful morning program had been replaced by breaking news banners. Bold letters scrolled across the bottom. Escalation in the Middle East. Troops deployed amid rising violence. Images filled the screen. Smoke rising over distant desert cities. Convoys of armor vehicles. Soldiers in camouflage uniforms moving in formation. Helen's breath caught in her throat. She knew Michael's unit had been training in that region. The anchor's voice was measured but grim. Reports of skirmishes, casualties not yet confirmed, the situation volatile. Her phone nearly slipped from her hand. She pressed it to her ear again, her voice breaking. "Rachel, do you think Michael?" "I don't know," Rachel whispered, her own fear palpable. "I just thought you needed to know." Helen barely heard her. The room spun as the images on the screen blurred. She sank into her armchair, her body heavy, her pulse hammering. Hours passed in a haze until, at last, the phone rang again. This time, the number was unfamiliar, but her heart leapt. She answered in a rush. Michael. Hey, Mom. The sound of his voice, alive, steady, almost casual, flooded her with relief, so fierce she nearly sobbed. Michael. Oh, thank God. I saw the news. They said. Don't believe everything you see, he interrupted gently. We're fine. It's just training exercises, nothing serious. Things look worse on TV than they really are. But they showed fighting. It's not us, he insisted, his tone reassuring. Contract soldiers handle that. We're just here to practice. We're not even near the hot zones. Please, Mom, don't worry. Helen clutched the phone as if it were his hand. She wanted to believe him, wanted to wrap herself in the comfort of his words. But doubt lingered, gnawing. Promise me you're safe, Michael. I promise, he said softly. I'll call you soon. Don't stress, okay? I love you. The line clicked, and the silence that followed was deafening. Days stretched into weeks. No more calls came. Helen checked her phone obsessively, the battery drained from constant recharging. She left the television on, the background hum of headlines filling the silence of her home. Each newscast carved deeper lines of worry into her face. Reports grew darker. Roadside bombings, ambushes, sudden escalations. Though the army never listed names, the mere mention of casualties left her cold. At the grocery store, neighbors stopped her in the aisles. Any word from Michael? One asked kindly, her eyes soft with pity. He's serving, isn't he? Brave boy, another chimed in. Helen forced a smile, her answers clipped. He's fine. He'll be home before we know it. But behind her closed doors, she wilted. Her appetite vanished. Nights brought no rest, only the relentless churn of worry. The once lively house grew oppressive with silence. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows made her startle, as if bad news might knock on her door at any second. After nearly a month of silence, Helen could no longer stand the waiting. She dressed carefully one morning, her hand shaking as she buttoned her coat and took the bus into town. The army office sat on a quiet street near the courthouse, its flag snapping briskly in the cold wind. She climbed the steps, her chest tight, and entered the sterile lobby. Behind the counter, a young staff sergeant looked up politely. Ma'am, can I help you? Helen's voice cracked as she leaned forward. My son, Private Michael O'Connor. I haven't heard from him in weeks. Please, I need to know if he's all right. The sergeant tapped on a keyboard, his expression neutral. After a moment, he looked up. Everything is fine, Mrs. O'Connor. Your son is serving with his unit. If there were an incident, you would have been notified immediately. No news is good news. Then why won't he call me? His phone. Communications are restricted in his current assignment, the sergeant interrupted gently but firmly. It's normal. He'll contact you when it's allowed. Helen's hands trembled against the counter. She wanted to demand more, to shout, to tear through the walls until she found the truth. But the calm certainty in his voice left her powerless. She nodded slowly, thanked him, and stumbled back into the cold daylight. On the bus ride home, she pressed her forehead against the window, watching the blur of buildings pass. She tried to repeat the sergeant's words in her mind. No news is good news. But in her heart, unease coiled tighter, whispering that silence could just as easily mean danger. And yet, with no proof, no answers, Helen forced herself to wait, trapped between fragile hope and gnawing dread. The letter arrived on a gray morning in early winter, folded crisply in an envelope stamped with the seal of the Department of the Army. Helen O'Connor found it wedged in her mailbox, its stark lettering instantly chilling her blood. She stood frozen on her porch, staring at it as if it might vanish if she refused to touch it. When at last she opened it, her vision blurred. She was requested to appear at the Army Casualty Assistance Office in Wilkes-Barre. No explanation, just a date, a time, and a directive. Her hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped the paper. For the rest of the day, she moved like a sleepwalker, her chest constricted, her mind spinning with dread. The next morning, Rachel insisted on driving her. The young woman's face was pale, her jaw tight, as she guided the old sedan down the slushy highway. Helen barely spoke, her hands knotted together in her lap. Every mile closer to the office felt like a mile deeper into nightmare. The building was squat and unremarkable, its flag flying high in the frigid wind. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, their harsh glow illuminating spotless white walls. Helen and Rachel sat in stiff chairs, the silence broken only by the hum of a vending machine. Finally, a man in uniform entered the room. He was middle-aged, with neatly pressed sleeves and weary eyes that avoided hers for too long. He introduced himself as Captain Harris and motioned for Helen to follow him into a smaller office. Rachel stayed behind, her face drawn tight with worry. Inside, the captain gestured for Helen to sit. She did, her heart hammering so loudly she could hear it in her ears. The officer drew in a slow breath, then spoke the words she would never forget. "Mrs. O'Connor, I regret to inform you that your son, Private First Class Michael O'Connor, has died while in service." The room tilted. Helen gripped the edge of the chair as her throat constricted. No, that's not possible. He was 19. He was healthy. There must be some mistake. The officer's gaze dropped to the file in his hands. The report states the cause was cardiac arrest, a sudden heart attack. Helen's laugh came sharp and hysterical, torn from her chest. Heart attack? At 19? He was an athlete. He ran track, he played ball. He never had a problem with his heart. The captain's voice softened, but it carried the tone of finality. "I'm sorry, ma'am. That is the information we were given. Sometimes these things happen." Helen's fist shook. "Where is he? When can I bring him home?" The pause that followed was unbearable. Captain Harris cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "Your son was buried overseas, near the base where he was stationed. The circumstances made it impossible to repatriate the body at this time." The words slammed into her like blows. Buried overseas. Without her. Without a funeral, without a chance to hold his hand, to lay flowers to say goodbye. She had given them her boy, and they had put him in the ground an ocean away without even asking. Her scream broke through the walls of the office, raw and guttural. She rose to her feet, her sobs tearing from her throat. "You buried my son like a stranger? You didn't even let me see him." The captain stood, his face grim with discomfort, but he did not touch her. He simply murmured, "I am so very sorry for your loss." Helen stumbled from the office, tears blinding her vision. Rachel was on her feet in the waiting room before Helen even reached her. "No," Rachel whispered, her hands catching Helen's arms. "No, it can't be true." But Helen could only shake her head, her sobs racking her body. Together, they walked out into the brittle air, where Helen collapsed against Rachel's shoulder, her cries carrying across the parking lot. The days that followed blurred into one another. There was no casket, no body, only a folded flag mailed to her door, and a packet of papers she couldn't bring herself to read. Rachel stayed by her side, cooking meals Helen could not eat, answering calls Helen could not bear to take. Neighbors came with casseroles, with flowers, with condolences that felt like daggers. They stood in her living room, their voices hushed and solemn, saying things like, "At least he served honorably, and he's in a better place now." Helen forced nods, but inside she was screaming. Each word of sympathy tore at her already raw heart. She did not want platitudes. She wanted Michael, his voice, his smile, his warmth. The boy she had raised alone, the boy who had promised to come back, the boy she had believed would have a shining future. At night, when the house grew silent and Rachel had gone home to rest, Helen sat alone in the dark. She pressed Michael's high school graduation photo to her chest, her tears soaking the frame. She whispered his name over and over, as if the sound of it might call him back. But the silence that answered her was as heavy as the earth they claimed had already covered his body. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of grief. Helen O'Connor drifted through her days like a ghost, the house unnaturally silent, her heart hollow. The folded flag sat on the mantel, its stars catching the morning light. But to her it felt like an accusation more than an honor. She had not seen her son. She had not said goodbye. The army had buried him somewhere far from her reach, and all she had left were words on paper and a void in her chest. Then, one afternoon, a thick envelope arrived by courier. Helen stared at it for long minutes before breaking the seal. Inside were official documents, Michael's death certificate, the final confirmation of what she already feared was true. Her hands shook as she placed the papers on the kitchen table, unable to read them. Rachel was the one who picked them up. She had stopped by after classes, her backpack slung over her shoulder, her face weary from worry. She scanned the certificate carefully, her brows furrowing. "Helen," she whispered, "didn't they tell you it was a heart attack?" Helen looked up slowly, her eyes rimmed red. "That's what the officer said. Cardiac arrest." Rachel tapped the paper with her finger, her voice tightening. "That's not what this says. Look, cause of death, pneumonia." Helen blinked, confusion flashing across her face. She snatched the document from Rachel's hands and read the words herself. Pneumonia, not heart failure. Her heart began to pound in her ears. "No, that's impossible. They told me he was healthy. He never had lung problems. None. Why would they tell me heart attack if this says pneumonia?" Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's not the only thing." She flipped through the pages again. His date of birth, it says March 26th. But Michael's birthday is the 25th, isn't it? Helen's stomach lurched. "Of course it is. I remember the moment he came into this world. It was the 25th. They got it wrong." Her voice trembled, anger threading through the grief. "How do you mistake a birthday? How do you confuse the cause of death?" The room seemed to close in on her. She pressed her palms flat against the table to steady herself, her breath coming in shallow bursts. All at once, the fragile trust she had clung to shattered. The official story was unraveling, the seams coming apart under the slightest tug. Rachel leaned closer, her eyes fierce. "Helen, something's not right. They're hiding something. They rushed to bury him overseas. They gave you conflicting reports, and now the paperwork doesn't match. This isn't just sloppiness." Helen's voice cracked. "Then what is it? Why would they lie?" "I don't know," Rachel admitted, "but we can't just accept this. We need answers. We need to see for ourselves." The words lodged in Helen's chest, both terrifying and electrifying. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "Exhumation," she whispered. "We have to bring him back. We have to know if it's really him in that grave." Rachel nodded without hesitation. "Yes, it's the only way." The very next morning, Helen called the army office. Her voice shook as she demanded an explanation. Demanded to know why the documents didn't match what she had been told. The staff officer on the line spoke carefully, his tone clipped. "Mrs. O'Connor, I assure you the reports are accurate. Variations in documentation sometimes occur when information is transmitted quickly." "Variations?" Helen snapped. "My son's cause of death changed. His birthday is wrong. That's not a variation, that's a lie." There was a pause on the other end. Then the officer's voice hardened. "Mrs. O'Connor, we strongly advise you to let this matter rest. Exhumation is not possible. The burial took place overseas under special circumstances. National security concerns prevent us from moving remains at this time. Additionally, health risks, potential infectious disease make it unsafe." Helen's hand clenched so tightly around the phone that her knuckles whitened. "You expect me to believe that? You buried my son without me, and now you refuse to let me even see him." "I'm sorry," the officer repeated, unyielding. "This is final." The line went dead. Helen lowered the phone slowly, her entire body trembling. She could feel the fury coursing through her veins, hot and sharp, burning through the fog of her grief. They were lying. She knew it now with certainty. Whatever had happened to Michael, the army was determined to keep it hidden. Rachel was waiting in the kitchen, her eyes searching Helen's face. "Well." "They said no," Helen whispered. Then her voice broke into a sob. "They said national security, health risks, excuses." She sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. "Rachel, they're covering something up. I can feel it. My boy deserved better than this." Rachel knelt beside her, gripping her hands tightly. "Then we'll fight. We'll find out the truth, Helen. We'll do whatever it takes." For the first time since the nightmare began, Helen felt a flicker of strength inside her grief. The army could deny her, neighbors could whisper, the whole world could turn its back, but she was still a mother. And mothers do not stop fighting for their children. She lifted her head, tears streaking her cheeks, and met Rachel's steady gaze. "Then we act," she said. And in that moment, amidst the silence of her kitchen and the cold Pennsylvania twilight pressing against the windows, Helen crossed a line she could never step back from. The refusal from the army only deepened Helen O'Connor's torment. For nights on end, she lay awake in her small Scranton home, staring at the ceiling, the words "national security" echoing through her skull. She knew excuses when she heard them. She had worked in offices long enough to recognize when someone was hiding behind rehearsed language. And now, those excuses stood between her and the truth about her son. By the end of the week, she could no longer bear it. Sitting at the kitchen table with Rachel, Helen leaned forward, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice firm. "If they won't let me exhume him, then I'll do it myself." Rachel froze, her fork halfway to her lips. "Helen, you can't be serious. That's illegal. You could get arrested." Desecrating a grave, Helen's eyes glistened, but her jaw was set. "Rachel, I carried him in my body. I raised him with these hands. Don't tell me I don't have the right to look into that coffin. If the army won't give me the truth, I'll take it." Rachel shook her head, fear flickering across her face. "How would you even do something like that? It's not like we can just walk into the cemetery with shovels." "I've thought about it," Helen admitted. "We find men who won't ask questions. People desperate enough to take cash and do what we need. There are always drifters at the bus station. We offer them money, enough that they can't say no." Rachel pressed her palms to her forehead, her voice cracking. "Helen, this could ruin you." "If you're caught, then let them catch me," Helen snapped, her voice trembling with both fury and pain. "I'd rather go to jail than sit here not knowing where my son is, or if he's even in that grave. If there's the slightest chance he isn't, I have to see." Rachel sat in silence for a long moment, the ticking of the clock filling the room. Finally, she lifted her eyes, her voice soft but resolute. "If you're doing this, I'm not letting you go alone. I'll help. I'll distract the security guard. But Helen, promise me this won't destroy you." Helen reached across the table and gripped the young woman's hand. "Rachel, I'm already destroyed. This is the only thing keeping me standing." 2 nights later, they set the plan in motion. At the Greyhound station downtown, Helen found 2 men who looked worn by life. Unkempt, clothes frayed, the kind of men society passed by without a glance. She explained in hushed tones, offering them a wad of cash saved over years of scrimping. The men exchanged a glance, then shrugged. For that kind of money, they would dig. On a cold, moonlit night, the 4 of them made their way up the hill to the cemetery. Rachel carried a paper bag with a bottle of cheap whiskey, meant for the security guard whose small shack stood near the gate. The guard was old, lonely, and not immune to company. Rachel knocked softly on his door, her bright smile disarming. Before long, she was sitting across from him, pouring drinks, laughing nervously at his stories. Meanwhile, Helen stood by the grave. Her breath rose in pale clouds, her hands clenched around the strap of her purse. The two men began their work, shovels biting into the cold earth. Each clang of metal against stone jarred her bones. The sound of dirt hitting the growing mound seemed deafening in the still night. She sat on a nearby bench, her heart pounding so violently she feared it might stop. Every scrape of the shovel was a countdown. Every grunt of the laborers carried her closer to the truth she both longed for and dreaded. Time dragged, the hole deepening until one of the men grunted, "Got it!" The edge of the coffin appeared, the wood dark against the soil. With effort, they maneuvered it upward, the heavy box rising until it rested on the grass above the grave. Helen rose to her feet, her knees weak, her breath caught in her throat. She approached slowly, her eyes locked on the coffin as though it might vanish if she blinked. Her entire body shook, but she forced herself closer. The men looked at her expectantly. One raised an eyebrow. "You really want this opened?" Helen's voice came out in a whisper, but it carried a weight that silenced them. "Yes, open it." The lid creaked as they pried it loose. The sound echoed through the cemetery, sharp and unnatural. Then, with a final wrench, the coffin gaped open. Helen leaned forward, her eyes straining in the moonlight, and then her stomach dropped. Her hands flew to her mouth as a strangled cry escaped her lips. The coffin was empty. No uniform, no remains, nothing but darkness and the faint smell of earth. For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. The two men exchanged a startled glance, their bravado faltering. Rachel, having slipped away from the guard shack, arrived just in time to see Helen crumple against the side of the coffin, her sobs tearing through the night. "Dear God!" Rachel whispered, her face pale. The men shifted uneasily, one muttering, "This ain't right." Helen lifted her tear-streaked face, her voice hoarse, raw with anguish. "They lied. They buried nothing. My boy isn't here." Silence settled over the cemetery, thick and suffocating. The truth was worse than anything she had imagined. Michael was gone, and even his grave was a lie. Helen's scream tore through the night, echoing across the cemetery. She staggered backward from the coffin, her knees buckling. Rachel caught her before she could fall completely, her own face pale and stricken. The two men who had done the digging stared at the empty box, muttering curses under their breath. Helen fumbled in her purse with trembling hands, pulling out her phone. "I'm calling the police," she whispered. The men stiffened. One shook his head. "Lady, don't drag us into this. We'll be locked up." But Helen's voice was ragged, unyielding. "I don't care. This isn't about you. This is about my son." She punched in the numbers and pressed the phone to her ear. When the patrol car arrived, its headlights cut harsh beams across the gravestones. Two officers stepped out, their hands resting warily on their belts as they approached the bizarre scene. They looked from Helen, crumpled on the bench with Rachel at her side, to the two uneasy men, and finally to the open coffin lying in plain view. "What exactly is going on here?" one officer demanded. Helen's voice cracked as she rose unsteadily to her feet. "That coffin, my son, he was supposed to be in there. But it's empty. They lied to me." The officers exchanged doubtful glances. One muttered, "There's no way you two women did all this by yourselves." He looked at the men, who shifted nervously, mud caked on their boots. "It doesn't matter who dug," Helen snapped, surprising even herself with the steel in her tone. She pointed at the coffin, her hand trembling. "Look for yourselves. They told me my son was buried, but there is nothing here. Nothing." The officers bent down, their flashlights cutting across the hollow box. Silence followed. Whatever doubts they had evaporated. The grave was empty. By morning, the cemetery swarmed with activity. Local detectives cordoned off the area, while military investigators arrived in crisp uniforms, their faces tense. Questions rained down on Helen and Rachel, some sharp, others disbelieving. How had they known? Why had they dug? What had they expected to find? Helen answered through tears, her voice hoarse from sleepless nights and anguish. I just wanted to see my son. They told me heart attack, then pneumonia. They buried him overseas without me. And now this. She gestured to the coffin. Tell me, where is my boy? The investigators offered no immediate answers. But as the days turned into weeks, a story began to emerge, pieced together through leaks, whispers, and eventual confessions. Michael had not died of a heart attack. He had not succumbed to pneumonia. He had not even been safely tucked away in a training exercise, as they had so carefully told her. The truth was far harsher. His unit had been thrust into active combat, not drills. A sudden barrage of artillery had ripped through the desert terrain, explosions tearing craters into the earth. Amid the chaos, soldiers scattered. Some returned shaken, others injured. But Michael never came back. For hours they searched, calling his name, sweeping the blasted field. But the ground was mangled, the sand pocked with shell holes and debris. No body was recovered. And in the fog of war, with pressure mounting and superiors demanding explanations, decisions were made. Someone labeled him presumed dead. To avoid scrutiny, to sidestep questions about why a 19-year-old had been thrown into live combat, paperwork was altered. Reports were rewritten. A false cause of death was drafted. First a heart attack, then pneumonia. Somewhere along the chain, someone authorized a burial that never took place. They issued Helen a flag, a certificate, a hollow coffin, and hoped that would be enough to quiet the grief of a mother. But Helen had not been quiet, and now the truth could no longer be buried. The scandal spread quickly. Local newspapers splashed it across their front pages. Mother finds son's grave empty. National outlets picked up the story, questioning the Army's integrity. Military hearings were convened. Officers who had signed off on the false reports were summoned before tribunals. Their careers destroyed, some facing charges for falsifying official documents. Yet for Helen, there was no victory in their disgrace. Sitting in her small living room, she watched the news reports unfold, her hands trembling as the anchor recited the findings. She should have felt vindicated, but instead she felt hollow. Her son was gone. No one could say where he was, or if his body would ever be recovered. There was no grave to visit, no headstone to lay flowers on, no certainty of where his remains lay beneath the foreign soil. All she had was absence. The grief consumed her. Her once dark hair began to turn silver in streaks, as though each strand carried the weight of another sleepless night. Her neighbors noticed the change, whispering that Helen looked 20 years older than she had the previous fall. Rachel stayed close, doing what she could, but even her presence could not erase the emptiness. Every morning, Helen woke with the same thought pressing down on her chest. My son has no grave. My son has no resting place. And as the cold Pennsylvania winter settled in, the walls of her house seemed to close tighter around her, the silence heavier, the ache deeper. 6 months passed. The snow melted from the Scranton hills, leaving the streets slick with spring rain. Helen O'Connor moved through her days like someone who had forgotten what it meant to live. Her hair, once dark and thick, had turned nearly white. Each morning she forced herself from bed, not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She went through the motions, making tea, feeding the neighbor's cat when asked, answering Rachel's daily check-ins, but inside she was hollow. The folded flag still sat on her mantel, a cruel reminder of a son who had no grave. Neighbors avoided mentioning Michael now, afraid to stir her grief. Rachel remained steadfast, often staying overnight to keep her company, but even her presence couldn't soften the ache. Helen lived in a twilight world, suspended between denial and despair. Then, one damp morning, a knock rattled the front door. It was early, too early for the mailman, too early for Rachel. Helen froze, her mug halfway to her lips. The knock came again, firmer this time. Heart pounding, she rose and shuffled to the door. When she opened it, she nearly collapsed on the spot. Michael stood there. He was gaunt, his face thinner than she remembered, his eyes sunken from months of hardship. His uniform hung loosely on his frame, his posture weary, but his eyes, those familiar blue eyes, were alive. "Mom," he said softly, his voice hoarse but unmistakable. "I'm home." Helen's breath left her in a sharp cry. The world tilted, colors swirling, and before she could form another word, her body gave out. Michael lunged forward, catching her just before she hit the floor. "Mom, Mom, it's me. Please stay with me." When she opened her eyes again, she was on the couch, a blanket pulled over her shoulders. Michael knelt beside her, clutching her hand as though it were the only thing keeping him grounded. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched his face. The warmth of his skin brought a fresh flood of tears. You're alive," she whispered, disbelief and joy colliding in her chest. "But they told me you were dead. They said you were buried." Michael's voice broke. "I know. I heard about it when they brought us back. I'm so sorry, Mom. I couldn't reach you. They wouldn't let us." Her tears streamed unchecked. "Where were you? What happened to you?" He drew in a ragged breath and began to explain. When the artillery strike had torn through the training field, he had been knocked unconscious by the blast. When he awoke, he was surrounded by strangers, armed men who took him and several others as prisoners. For months, he lived in captivity, crammed into a dark room with other soldiers. Barely enough food to survive, his injuries left untreated. Days blurred into nights, the weeks stretching into what felt like years. "We didn't know if we'd ever get out," he said, his voice low. But finally negotiations worked. They transferred us, and I was taken to a military hospital. They kept us under watch, made us go through debriefings before they let us contact anyone. I wanted to call you every day, Mom. I swear. But I wasn't allowed. And by the time I could, all I wanted was to come straight here. Helen pressed her forehead against his, sobbing openly. "I prayed every night. I begged God to bring you back to me. And he did. He did." Michael pulled her into his arms, holding her as tightly as his frail body allowed. They wept together, mother and son, reunited in a moment so overwhelming it seemed the entire world fell away. Word spread quickly through Scranton. Neighbors who had offered condolences now gaped in disbelief when they saw Michael walking beside his mother down the street. Rachel arrived within the hour, sprinting up the porch steps and flinging herself into Michael's arms. Their embrace was desperate, unrestrained, the reunion of two souls who had feared they would never meet again. In the months that followed, Michael slowly regained his strength. His body healed, though the scars of captivity lingered in the shadows of his eyes. The army granted him an honorable discharge, freeing him from the burden of further service. For the first time since high school, Michael could plan for a future that wasn't defined by war. That fall, he enrolled at Penn State University, determined to pursue the technical degree he had dreamed of before everything changed. Helen accompanied him on his first day of classes, her heart swelling with pride as she watched him step into the lecture hall, alive, free, and full of potential. Rachel was by his side always. Their bond, tested by distance and despair, had only grown stronger. Not long after, talk of marriage filled the air, plans for a small ceremony already forming. Helen wept again, but these were tears of joy, the kind she thought she would never shed again. At last, her house no longer felt like a tomb. The folded flag remained on the mantel, but now it was joined by photographs, Michael smiling at his desk at Penn State, Michael and Rachel holding hands. Michael standing tall though thinner than before, his arm draped around his mother's shoulders. Helen had walked through the valley of death, her soul crushed by lies and grief. But now, as she sat on her porch watching her son and his fiancée laugh in the yard, she felt something stir inside her chest, something she thought had died the day they told her he was gone. Hope. Her son had come back to her, and with him, life had returned as well. I used to think love would come quietly like a warm breeze on a spring morning, subtle and kind. But the day I met Adrian Blake, it came like a lightning strike. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind where exhaustion clings to you after a long day of lectures. I climbed onto the bus, juggling my backpack and an old canvas tote, eyes down, ready to zone out until my stop. "Here, take my seat," a deep voice said. I looked up. He stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a charcoal gray coat that looked like it belonged on a magazine cover, not on public transit. His smile was easy, warm, and disarming. "Thank you," I murmured, sliding into the seat. I expected him to pull out his phone and ignore me, but he stayed near, holding the rail, his eyes flicking to me with curiosity. "You don't look like you're from around here," he said lightly, almost cautious. I blinked, a little surprised. "I'm a student, University of Texas, languages major." "That explains it," he said, studying me just long enough to make me feel noticed, but not uncomfortable. Confident, but cautious. "Sorry, that probably sounds strange." I smiled despite myself. A little. He laughed softly, and it was warm, genuine, like he actually cared what I thought. We talked all the way to my stop about nothing really. Coffee shops, favorite parks, how Texas weather couldn't decide if it wanted to be summer or winter. When the bus hissed to a stop, I stood, ready to disappear back into my normal, quiet life. But he called out, "Wait, can I get your number? I'd like to see you again." Normally, I would have said no. I wasn't the type to hand my number to a stranger. But something in the way he looked at me, like I was the only person on that bus, made me nod. Sure. The very next night, I found myself standing outside a restaurant I had no business being in. The kind of place with soft golden lighting, sleek cars lined up at the valet, and a maitre d' who looked at you like they already knew your credit score. I hesitated, smoothing my simple black dress. And then Adrian appeared, smiling like I was exactly who he wanted to see. "You look incredible," he said, kissing the back of my hand like some old-world gentleman. Dinner with him felt like stepping into another life. He ordered wine I couldn't pronounce and told me stories about growing up in Europe, about his adoptive parents, Robert and Helena DuPont, who lived mostly in Paris and Geneva, traveling between art shows and charity events. He said he returned to Texas because he wanted to reconnect with his roots. I listened, fascinated. He wasn't bragging. He just shared, like someone who trusted me with pieces of himself. And when he asked about me, my classes, my family, my dreams, he actually listened. By the time he walked me to my car, I realized something strange. I wanted to see him again. From then on, we were inseparable. Study sessions turned into coffee dates. Coffee dates turned into weekend hikes, and weekend hikes turned into late-night phone calls that stretched until dawn. Adrian had this way of making me feel like I mattered, like I wasn't just another college student grinding through assignments and part-time work. He'd text me good morning before my alarm went off and good night long after I'd fallen asleep. He made me laugh when I was stressed, brought me coffee on days I didn't think I could handle one more lecture, and once showed up at my apartment with flowers just because. It wasn't long before he started talking about the future. "You should meet my parents," he said one evening as we sat on the balcony of his downtown condo, the city lights glowing beneath us. "They'll love you. They've always wanted me to find someone special." I blinked, caught off guard by how fast everything was moving, but in a good way. "Are you sure? I mean, we've only been dating for long enough," he cut in with a grin. "Trust me, Sarah, you're different." No one had ever said that to me before, not like that. And I realized then how much I liked hearing it. For the first time in years, I let myself believe I could have a love that was safe and maybe even lasting. Before Adrian came along, my life was simple, maybe too simple. I grew up in a small town just outside Austin, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and most of your business. My childhood wasn't perfect, but it was honest and a little hard at times. My mom, Patricia, though everyone calls her Patty, was the kind of woman who could stretch $1 like magic. She worked long hours at the local grocery store, stocking shelves, running the register, doing whatever it took to keep food on our table. My dad left when I was 7. There were no phone calls, no birthday cards, just absence, like someone had cut a hole in our lives and left it there. Mom never said a bad word about him, but I could see how her eyes hardened whenever someone mentioned his name. She didn't have the luxury of bitterness. She had 2 daughters to raise, and she did it on her own. Then there was Jenna, my older sister by 3 years. She used to be my hero, confident, graceful, unstoppable. Jenna was a dancer, and not just any dancer. She was winning competitions, getting invited to regional showcases, and talking about moving to New York one day. Watching her perform was like watching someone fly. Then came the accident. A rainy evening, a slick road, and a driver who couldn't stop in time changed everything. Jenna's left leg took most of the impact. The doctors saved it, but her career, it was gone. She tried for months to push through, to keep dancing despite the pain, but eventually she quit. And then her fiancé left. He said all the right things. It's not you, it's me, and I just can't handle seeing you like this. But the truth was simpler. He didn't want a life with someone who couldn't dance anymore. Jenna retreated into herself after that. She stopped performing, stopped dating, stopped living in a way. Some days she was okay, joking and chatting like old times, but most days she stayed in her room with headphones on, pretending the world outside didn't exist. I think watching her go through that is what made me cautious about relationships. I told myself I was focusing on school, on working toward a degree in Spanish language and literature, but deep down I was just scared of giving someone that kind of power over me. Still, there was a part of me that longed for something real. Not just a fling, not just a boyfriend, but someone who saw me, who stayed. That's probably why Adrian felt like such a miracle. He stepped into my life with his easy smile and warm voice, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel weighed down by everything I'd seen go wrong. Mom noticed before anyone else. One Sunday, she set down her mixing spoon and stared at me. "You're smiling more lately," she said, half accusing, half teasing. "Is there a boy involved?" I wanted to deny it like I usually did when she pried, but instead I laughed and nodded. "Yeah, Mom, there's someone." She studied me for a long moment, like she was weighing whether to be happy or worried. Finally, she sighed and said softly, "Just promise me one thing, Sarah. Take care of your heart. It's worth more than you know." At the time, I thought she was just being protective. I didn't know how right she was. When Adrian invited me to dinner with his parents, I was nervous but also excited. Meeting someone's family meant something. It meant we weren't just casually dating anymore. It meant he was serious. "They're a little different," he said with a grin as he steered his car through winding roads. "Grew up in France, lived all over Europe. You'll like them." That word, different, echoed in my head all day. My roommate, Emily, gave me a strange piece of advice before I left. If they speak French, pretend you don't understand it. People say things when they think you can't follow along. I almost laughed. "Emily, I'm not fluent. I only took beginner French for my language elective." "Exactly. Don't let them know you understand even a little," she said, wagging a finger. "Just smile and nod. Trust me." So that's what I decided to do. The DuPont home looked like something out of an architectural magazine. Sleek modern lines softened by warm lighting, with framed European art lining the walls. Helena DuPont greeted us at the door, a tall, elegant woman with silver-streaked hair swept back into a perfect bun. Robert, her husband, followed, quiet but with an assessing look in his eyes that made me sit a little straighter. "Bienvenue," Helena said warmly, kissing Adrian on both cheeks before turning to me. And you must be Sarah. I smiled, murmuring hello. Adrian quickly added, She mostly speaks English, Mom. Helena's smile softened, but something in her eyes flickered. Interest? Amusement? I couldn't tell. We sat at a long oak table set like a painting. Polished silverware, crystal glasses, flickering candles. At first, everything felt almost perfect. Helena asked polite questions about school and family. Robert nodded along, occasionally adding a short comment. Adrian kept one hand resting lightly on mine, as if to remind me I belonged there. But then, midway through dessert, Helena glanced at her husband and switched to French. Elle voit smooth, deliberate. Elle ne sait pas pourquoi nous avons besoin d'elle, n'est-ce pas? She doesn't know why we need her, does she? My breath caught, but I kept my face blank, pretending I hadn't understood a word. Adrian answered quickly, also in French. Non, elle ne sait rien. No, she doesn't know a thing. Helena smiled faintly, taking another sip of wine, and turned the conversation back to English, complimenting my dress as if nothing unusual had happened. I forced a polite smile, but inside my heart was pounding. Need me? For what? The rest of dinner passed in a blur. I nodded when I was supposed to, smiled when it felt right, all while replaying those French words in my mind over and over. On the drive back, Adrian was cheerful, asking me what I thought of his parents. They're very sophisticated, I said carefully. He chuckled. Yeah, they can be intimidating. Don't take it personally. They've just lived in a different world for so long. I nodded, staring out the window, but I couldn't shake that feeling, like I'd just stepped into something I didn't understand. That night, lying in bed, I whispered the words I'd overheard under my breath. She doesn't know why we need her. Whatever that meant, it wasn't about love or acceptance or family. It was about me being useful to them somehow. And for the first time since I'd met Adrian, a cold thread of fear slipped through the warmth I felt for him. 2 weeks after that dinner, Adrian surprised me with an idea. Let's get away this weekend, he said, leaning casually against my kitchen counter. Just you and me. I booked a cabin out in the hill country. You could use a break. We both could. On the surface, it sounded perfect, quiet, romantic, far from school stress, and the echo of Helena's words still stuck in my head. I hesitated, but Adrian noticed and cupped my face gently. You've been tense lately. Let me take care of you for once. I nodded slowly. Okay, yeah, that sounds nice. The drive itself was beautiful. Rolling hills, wildflowers swaying in the warm Texas wind, and Adrian humming softly to the radio. He seemed completely at ease, like this was just another step in our relationship. I wanted to believe it. When we arrived, I stepped out and blinked at the view. The cabin looked like something from a travel magazine. Wood and stone wraparound porch, and beyond it, a shimmering lake reflecting the golden evening sun. Pretty amazing, huh? Adrian said, slipping an arm around my waist. Come on, let's unpack and start dinner. Inside, the place was even more luxurious. Fireplace, soft rugs, a kitchen already stocked. Adrian opened a bottle of red wine and poured me a glass. To us, he said with a warm smile. We talked, we laughed, we cooked together, and for a while I forgot about that nagging voice in my head. Until I noticed how often he refilled my glass. By the time I sat down, my head felt light. Adrian, I feel tired. My words came out thick, my vision tilting. He was by my side in an instant, lowering me gently onto the couch. Shoot, just rest, he whispered, his voice calm and oddly distant. I woke up to the smell of damp wood and something metallic. My head throbbed, and my hands wouldn't move. They were tied behind me. I was on a cold concrete floor in what looked like a basement. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Then I heard Adrian's voice, calm and deliberate, from somewhere above. Yeah, she's ready. Everything's in place. A chill shot down my spine. She's ready? Ready for what? I twisted my wrists, wincing as the ropes cut into my skin. Adrian, what are you doing? My voice cracked, panicked. He appeared at the top of the stairs, descending slowly, his expression soft, almost tender but wrong. "Sarah, you don't understand now, but you will. This is going to change your life." My heart pounded, so hard I thought I might pass out. "Untie me. Adrian, please. Whatever this is, it isn't funny." He crouched in front of me, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Should trust me. Soon you'll thank me." And in that moment, staring at the man I thought I loved, I knew two things. He wasn't who I thought he was, and if I didn't get out, I might never get home again. The ropes dug into my wrists, burning with every movement, but I didn't care. Panic sharpened everything. My breathing, the cold floor beneath me, even the faint hum of crickets outside. Adrian's voice drifted from upstairs. "Calm. Steady. Yeah, she's ready. Everything's in place, no. She doesn't suspect a thing." My stomach twisted. "She's ready? For what?" I looked around the basement. A single dangling bulb cast pale light over the concrete walls. There, a rusty nail sticking from an old wooden doorframe. I shifted, inching toward it on my knees, praying the ropes didn't snap loud enough for him to hear. My pulse throbbed in my ears as I began rubbing the ropes against the nail. At first, nothing. Then a strand gave way, then another, until one hand slipped free. I froze, listening. Adrian was still talking upstairs. I untied the rest with trembling fingers, then moved to my ankles. My hands were slick with sweat, but finally the ropes fell away. The stairs were too risky. I turned to the small window near the ceiling. It was tight, but I shoved it open and crawled through, scraping my arms on the rough frame. Cold night air hit my face as I fell to the ground outside. I ran. Branches whipped my arms and face as I tore through the woods. Behind me, a shout split the night. "Sarah, stop. It's not what you think." I didn't stop. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but I kept running. Every snapping branch sounded like his footsteps closing in. Then, ahead, a light, faint but real. A cabin. I sprinted toward it, tripping on a root and hitting the ground hard before scrambling up again. "Help!" I screamed, pounding on the door. "Please help me." The door swung open, and a man filled the frame, tall, broad, wearing a gray hoodie. Beside him, a Belgian Malinois growled low, muscles coiled to spring. "What's going on?" he demanded, eyes narrowing. "Someone, he drugged me. Tied me up, he's coming, please." My voice cracked as tears spilled down my face. The man didn't hesitate. He stepped aside, pulling me in and snapping a command. "Duke, watch!" The dog bolted out, barking fiercely into the night. From somewhere behind us, Adrian cursed and retreated into silence. The man slammed the door, locking it. "You're safe now," he said firmly, scanning me from head to toe. "You're shaking. Sit down." I collapsed onto a worn leather chair, my body trembling uncontrollably as adrenaline drained out of me. "Who tied you up?" he asked, kneeling to look at the rope burns on my wrists. My boyfriend. Adrian Blake," I stammered. "He's not who I thought he was," he said. "He was helping me." But my voice trailed off as the reality hit me. I had trusted the wrong person, and it had nearly cost me everything. The man's jaw tightened. "Name's Mark Bennett. I live out here, ex-army, now search and rescue. You're safe here." "Thank you," I whispered, tears spilling again. "First things first, we call the sheriff." He grabbed his phone and dialed, speaking quickly, efficiently. When he finished, he handed me a blanket and crouched beside me again. "You're okay now. Whatever he planned, it's over." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Adrian had a reason for what he did, and until I knew what it was, I wouldn't feel truly free. The deputies arrived 20 minutes later. By then, my mom and sister had shown up too. Mark had called them when I couldn't form words. Mom wrapped me in her arms so tight I could barely breathe. "You're safe now, baby," she whispered. But even as I clung to her, one thought kept echoing. Why did they need me? I didn't have an answer, yet. The sheriff's office felt colder than the night outside. A deputy wrapped a blanket around my shoulders as I sat under the harsh, fluorescent lights, trying to keep my breathing steady. "Take your time, Miss Mitchell," one officer said gently. "Start from the beginning." So I did every detail: meeting Adrian, falling in love, dinner with his parents, the words in French I wasn't supposed to understand, and finally waking up tied in a basement. When I finished, there was a long silence. The lead investigator, Detective Harris, tapped his pen against his notebook. "You said you understood some French. What exactly did you hear?" I repeated it carefully. "She doesn't know why we need her, does she?" And Adrian's reply, "No, she doesn't know a thing." Harris exchanged a look with another deputy. "That tracks with some intel we've been piecing together." I frowned. "Intel? On what?" He leaned forward. "Adrian Blake isn't just a charming boyfriend. His adoptive parents, Robert and Helena DuPont, are under quiet investigation for international fraud." "Fraud?" My voice cracked. "They've been posing as humanitarian consultants, claiming to help wealthy families locate missing relatives. They charge millions, but in most cases, they don't actually find anyone. And when they do deliver someone," Harris's eyes met mine, steady and grave, "they deliver the wrong person. A look-alike." My stomach sank. "A look-alike like me." Harris nodded. "One of their clients is Viktor Ryabintsev, a billionaire who lost his young daughter years ago. Word is he's still desperate to find her and willing to pay whatever it takes. Your resemblance to her? It's uncanny." The room tilted for a moment. "So Adrian, he never loved me." "He targeted you," Harris said bluntly. "Built trust, made sure you were emotionally invested, then planned to deliver you to Ryabintsev as his missing daughter. They would have faked enough documents to make it look real." A chill ran through me, so deep I felt like I'd never be warm again. By morning, deputies had swarmed the cabin where Adrian had taken me. They found the ropes, the sedative-laced wine, and a duffel bag full of forged paperwork, including a passport with my picture, but someone else's name. Robert and Helena were arrested at a small private airfield, attempting to board a plane bound for France. Adrian was caught hours later, hiding in an abandoned storage facility. When they brought him in, I was still at the station, giving a formal statement. He looked calm, almost resigned. "Sarah," he said softly as they let him past me in handcuffs, "you don't have to hate me. I was giving you a better life." I stared at him, stunned. "You call that a better life? Drugging me? Lying to me? Selling me like I'm property?" For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face, maybe shame, maybe regret. But it was gone in an instant as they took him away. The FBI became involved within days. It turned out this wasn't the first time the DuPonts had tried something like this. They had executed similar scams in Europe, swapping in lookalikes for missing heirs. Most victims had been too embarrassed or too traumatized to come forward. But I wasn't going to be silent. I gave my statement to anyone who needed it. I sat through endless hours of interviews and depositions, and each time I spoke, I felt like I was clawing back a piece of myself that Adrian had tried to steal. Still, the nights were hard. I'd wake up gasping, thinking I was still in that basement, still tied down, still listening to Adrian's voice telling me I'd thank him later. Mark Bennett, the man who saved me, stopped by often just to check in. Sometimes he didn't even say much, just sat on the porch with me while Duke, his Belgian Malinois, lay at our feet. Somehow, that quiet company made it easier to breathe. I was free, but I still didn't feel safe. Not yet. The weeks after Adrian's arrest blurred together. I was safe, but safety didn't feel the way I thought it would. Every night, I jolted awake, convinced I was still in that basement, still hearing his voice whisper, "You'll thank me later." Mom tried to help in the only way she knew how, by cooking. Every time I turned around, there was another casserole in the fridge or a fresh pie cooling on the counter. Jenna tried too, awkwardly at first, but she slowly began opening up about her own pain. "You didn't deserve that," she told me one afternoon, her eyes glossy. And I didn't deserve what happened to me either. Maybe we both have to stop blaming ourselves for what other people did. Her words stuck with me, but it was Mark who helped me begin to breathe again. He showed up at my porch one evening, Duke trotting happily by his side. "Thought I'd check in," he said, scratching the dog's ears. "See how you're holding up." I shrugged, unable to hide how tired I felt. Some days are fine, some not so much. Mark nodded like he understood more than I could put into words. That's normal. Healing isn't neat. It's messy and it's slow. And that's okay. His voice carried a weight of experience I hadn't noticed before. Eventually, he told me why. For years earlier, his wife and young daughter had died in a car accident. He'd left the army after that and moved out to the hill country, choosing solitude over anything else. "I couldn't stand people looking at me like I was broken," he admitted one night as we walked Duke near the lake. "So I came out here where nobody knew me." I looked at him, realizing he understood what it meant to feel safe and unsafe at the same time, to want connection but fear it. Over the next few weeks, we talked more. Sometimes about big things, grief, trust, starting over, and sometimes about small things like which coffee shop had the best cinnamon rolls. But every conversation felt safe. Mark didn't try to fix me. He didn't tell me to smile or move on. He just let me be. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting everything gold, Mark said something that stopped me in my tracks. "You're stronger than you think. You didn't just survive, Sarah. You ran, you fought, you got yourself out. That's grit most people never find." I swallowed hard. "I don't feel strong." "You don't have to feel it to be it," he said softly. In time, we found ways to help each other. He encouraged me to take long walks again, without panicking at every snapping branch, and I encouraged him to reconnect with people, to let someone in again. Then came an unexpected twist. With help from Mark's old army contacts, we located Viktor Ryabintsev's real missing daughter, Julia. Watching father and daughter reunite after decades apart was overwhelming, not just for them, but for me. It reminded me that not everything ended in betrayal. Some things could still be good. That night, sitting on the porch with Mark and Duke, I felt something I hadn't felt since before Adrian. Peace. Mark handed me a cup of coffee and said quietly, almost shyly, "I like having you around." For the first time in a long time, I smiled a real smile. I like being around too. And in that moment, with Duke curled at our feet and the stars stretching endlessly above us, I realized something powerful. I wasn't scared anymore. Not of Mark, not of trusting someone new, and maybe not even of my own future. The seasons shifted as my life quietly rebuilt itself. What once felt like permanent darkness slowly warmed into something brighter, safer. Mark and I didn't rush anything, but somehow it still felt like we had been moving toward each other all along. He was patient, steady, the kind of man who let silence mean safety instead of awkwardness. One evening, Jenna stood in front of me, tears in her eyes without her crutches. "I got approved for the final phase of surgery," she said, voice trembling with joy. "It turned out Viktor Ryabintsev, grateful beyond words that we had helped reunite him with his real daughter, had paid for every procedure Jenna needed to dance again. The night before her surgery, Jenna took my hands and whispered, 'You saved me, Sarah. Without you, I'd still be hiding. You didn't just escape. You pulled me out of my own basement too.' I hugged her tightly, realizing healing was rarely just one person's journey. It rippled outward, touching everyone you loved. Months later, on a warm spring evening, Mark led me to the lake near his cabin. Duke bounded ahead, tail wagging, as if he knew something I didn't. "Sarah," Mark began, his voice carrying an edge of nervousness I'd never heard before. "I spent years thinking my life was over. That love was something I'd already lost. But then you came banging on my door, terrified and brave all at once, and you woke me up." He pulled out a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple, elegant ring. I don't know what the future looks like, but I know I want to face it with you. Will you marry me? Tears blurred my vision as I whispered, yes. For a moment, everything stood still, the wind, the trees, even my own fear. Because in that moment, I wasn't broken. I was whole. We had a small wedding in Jenna's favorite dance studio, the one she had refused to step foot in for years. That day, she danced again, slow, careful, but radiant, with Mark and me watching through tears. And a month later, as Mark and I unpacked the last box in the small house he'd been building, I held a pregnancy test in my trembling hands. Positive. That night, I stood on our porch, staring at the stars over the Texas Hill Country, one hand resting on my stomach, and whispered, "We're okay now, we're safe." I had thought the world would always feel dangerous after what happened, that trust would always feel impossible. But I was wrong. Sometimes life breaks you open so something better can grow. And this life I almost lost was finally beautifully mine again.